Webinar series sponsored by the Committee on the Present Danger, China. It is a distinct pleasure to be able to do so at a moment when, well, at least in certain circles, the issues that we raise in these webinars is getting more attention, if not always for the right reasons. At the moment, we are witnessing the Chinese Communist Party aggressively going after our friends in Japan, specifically the prime minister there, and using the pretext of comments she made in testimony before her parliament, known as the Diet, to seemingly not only threaten her personally, but threaten her country and create maybe even a casus belli, a pretext for war against Japan. This has resulted in a phone conversation with President Trump involving first Xi Jinping, the Chinese Communist Emperor, and the Prime Minister of Japan subsequently and separately. And we are going to talk a bit about all of that against the backdrop of what is our main purpose at the Committee on the Present Danger, China, namely the warning that China is engaged in warfare against us as we speak. That warfare is of an unrestricted character. Most of the 200 and, I don't know, I think it's probably 20 or so webinars that we've conducted so far in this series have documented one aspect or another of that multi-front, seemingly relentless pursuit of the destruction of our country in an unrestricted way, with the arguable exception of kinetic warfare, though, as we will talk about, the use of biological agents, namely COVID-19, and chemical warfare agents, namely fentanyl, really does rise, it seems to me, to the level of mass murder that can only be described as kinetic, even if it is non-explosive. So we're going to assess all of this. What is going on? What is Communist China up to? What does it intend? And most especially, what should we be doing now about it all? It's going to start with the proposition, picking up on an old advertising line from the 70s, I believe, which was used to promote Lipton soup. We're calling this program, Is It War Yet? And we're going to address the question of what will it take for us to acknowledge that China's belligerence, China's war-making has crossed the line. We're going to start with a woman whose, I think, contribution to successive campaigns against enemies of our country, notably as a scientist consulting with the United States Navy in the critical space of anti-submarine warfare during the Cold War with the Soviet Union. She is these days the president of the American Freedom Alliance and doing a marvelous job in that role, illuminating issues like the ones we'll be addressing today and much more, both in programs sponsored in Los Angeles, where AFA is based, and on the road. And I've personally been privileged, as have many of our Committee on the Present Danger China members and other top experts done with her, notably in the run-up to the 2024 election. Karen Sigeman is her name. Dr. Sigeman is a woman who has done some very, I think, enterprising thinking about this moment. I wanted her specifically to tee up our conversation by emphasizing a certain reality that is not often recognized, even as we fail to recognize that we are indeed at war. Dr. Sigeman, thank you for joining us. The floor is yours, ma'am.
Frank, thank you so much. It's always an honor to be part of everything that you do, and especially Committee on the Present Danger China webinars. And I just wanted to wish everybody a marvelous Thanksgiving as we look to tomorrow. And it's great to be with you all here today. Yes, as you noted, we did a number of events last year, and I did work as a scientist during the Cold War against the Soviet Union. And I was struck as we did our events last year that were called World War III, the early years, or World War Z, more specifically related to China. And the comparison between what we were doing last year and continue to do now versus when I had been coming up through the Cold War against the Soviet Union is at that time in the 80s, everybody around the world recognized that the whole world was in a situation that was the Cold War. It was a bipolar world. There were two superpowers. It was ideological. We were pitted against the axis of evil. We understood communism versus capitalism, the free world versus totalitarianism, and we knew we had to win, and we were united in that purpose. It was in the media. It was just absolutely everywhere. And contrast that to now, where when we put on the World War III events, we considered it another Cold War, although, as Frank has noted, and this is one reason we're here today, it is not entirely cold, and I'll talk about that in a second. But as it dawned on me, this difference, I was reminded of a philosophical query. If a tree falls in the woods and there's nobody there to hear it, does it still make a sound? And it just got me thinking that if you're in a war and nobody will acknowledge it, can we still lose? And there's three parts to that. If you're in a war, right? Are we in a war? And we would all argue we most certainly are in a war. China has declared people's war on us, total war. They have been waging war on us assiduously through various means, some of which are non-kinetic, they're demographic, they're ideological. There's money being sent to our schools, K through 12, and our universities, those various kinds. But I would also argue, while they're not kinetic in the violent, explosive kind that Frank mentioned, they have been lethal through fentanyl and COVID and various other means, so this cannot be ignored. So that's the first part. Are we at war? We most certainly are. They've been waging war on us. Nobody will acknowledge it. I would say not only will nobody acknowledge it, but it's tamped down, it's being reframed, it's being cast as it's just an economic situation, if that. So not only will they not acknowledge it, but it is suppressed. Can we still lose? Again, I would argue that we have in large part been losing, but again, that's why we all are here, to raise the alarm, to get us on war footing, to recognize that they have been at war against us. We cannot be lax in our attention towards it. We absolutely cannot lose, but as long as we refuse to acknowledge it, and by we, I mean political, in all the aspects of this, political, academic, media, universities, all these avenues that represent the ideal idea space, we will continue to lose. So again, I applaud you all, Frank, for having this, and everyone who's a panelist with me today. We've got to make the American public and our decision makers recognize that we have been in a state of war and we absolutely cannot lose. Thank you.
Dr. Sigeman, thank you. Well said, as always, and very much the keynote for today's conversation. We're going to turn next to Captain James Fennell, one of our most faithful contributors to these programs. We often start into the substantive conversation with him because he has a marvelous ability as a longtime, indeed career naval intelligence officer to help frame the threat environment that we're in. And we've asked him to do so in this particular moment by speaking first about that back and forth, as I've described it, between the Japanese, the Chinese, and now President Trump, and where that puts us at this particular juncture in terms of both our understanding of the nature of the war we're in and our pushing back against the Chinese threats that are now increasingly evident. He is providing us his thoughts on all of that as a product of our interview earlier this week on our television program, Securing America. And with his permission, we've edited a portion of that very powerful interview for the purposes of this webinar today. Let's go to his videotape now.
And there's been now 2 phone calls over the last 36 hours are very important. And the second one with Prime Minister Takaichi of Japan is the second call. But the first call between President Trump and General Secretary Xi Jinping, the Communist Party's leader, is, from my perception, a continuation of a concerted campaign to either drive the new Japanese Prime Minister out of office or to basically put her under so much political pressure domestically and internationally that she becomes not a serious concern for this PRC. And this all started back on the 7th of November when Prime Minister Takaichi had just been sworn in as the new leader of Japan and was asked a question by a Japanese opposition political party member in the parliament. What does this mean if the PRC was to invade Taiwan? And Prime Minister Takaichi used a phrase which is really important. It's called a survival threatening situation, something that's been used in the Japanese before, and it set off alarm bells in Beijing. But it really isn't a controversial statement by anybody who follows these issues for any length of time about what China's military, PLA, plan is to invade Taiwan will not be confined strictly to Taiwan. We have 50,000 plus Americans in Japanese bases up and down the Ryukyus and into the main islands of Japan. We have allies in the Philippines. We have ships and aircraft around the region. So do the Japanese. So it's very well expected, and from what we read, from what the Chinese military says and how they practice and the weapons that they've developed, that they would be attacking American and Japanese forces. So what Prime Minister Takaichi said is, hey, if that happened, that would be very serious to us. It's a rational thing to say. And within 24 hours of her saying that, the PRC's Consul General in Osaka basically said, we have no choice but to cut off the dirty neck that has been lunged at us without hesitation. Are you ready? And then for the next 3 weeks, we have seen the most unprecedented PRC propaganda campaign to smear, besmirch, call Prime Minister Takaichi a militarist, said that she's no different than the Japanese of World War II. And then China went through and said to their students around the 14th, 15th of November, don't travel to Japan, tourists don't go to Japan. Oh, and then around the 17th or 18th of November, China came out and told Japan, we're not going to buy any of your seafood. That's off the table now. And the talks that we were having about buying beef and meat, that's off the table as well. And they're ratcheting up. And over the weekend, they sent their ambassador to the United Nations, Ambassador Fu, went to the United Nations and presented a long letter explaining why Japan is militaristic and they're causing the problems in this region. So it is out of control, the war of words between these two. There's no question from the Chinese Communist Party's perspective, they are engaged in a cognitive war against the United States of America. And that includes information war, psychological war, legal warfare, and what they call their comprehensive national power. They have been developing their military kinetic forces. But right now, up until today, everything has been non-kinetic. China has been engaged in this non-kinetic warfare for decades, and they've been shaping the arena. They play it with things such as they call themselves a developing country, and therefore they continue to get, most favored nation status, and they get foreign direct investment, and they get special dispensation for the World Trade Organization, and they get it added to the basket of reserve currencies several years ago, almost 15 years ago. Point after point after point, they play the international arena to their advantage, but when it doesn't go their way, like in 2016, when the Permanent Court of Arbitration said, you have no claim over the South China Sea and the quote-unquote 9-dash line, they said, forget it, that's a farce, we don't follow that. So they obey or follow the international order when it benefits them, and then they disregard it when it benefits them. And they are sending out their legion of agents across the country. We just saw this big story here with Larry Summers, the former president of Harvard, who was, everybody wants to follow the salacious, romantic side of that. But the real story is that the woman that he was engaging with is the daughter of a senior CCP official who was the first president of the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, which was Xi Jinping's money side of the Belt and Road Initiative. It was the bank for the Belt and Road Initiative. And that's who Larry Summers was playing around with, was the daughter of that first president of AIIB. We have other stories of Dr. Lieber at Harvard, chemist who was involved with taking money from the Chinese. There's so many stories of the Chinese doing what we call elite capture, buying off the elites in America, whether it's in academia, in our government, or in Wall Street. And then we, on the other hand, are investing thousands and millions and trillions of dollars into China through greed and naivety to build the companies of America that are now multinational. We have invested in China, and what are they doing with that money? They're building their infrastructure, but more importantly, they're building the kinetic tools that are going to be used in a conflict if they can't get Taiwan to knuckle under with non-kinetic means. So if the lawfare and the cognitive warfare and the information warfare don't bamboozle Taiwan into submitting to them, which it appears it's not, then, and it's certainly not going to work on Japan, then China is going to be left with a hard decision here in about 5 years, whether or not in the next 5 years, it could happen now, but sometime in the next 5 years, they're going to have to sit down inside the compound in Beijing at Zhongnanhai, and Xi and the senior leaders of the Standing Committee of the Politburo are going to have to say, are we going to go to the next level now and use military force? And they have prepared a military that can do great damage, great damage to America, kill thousands of Americans that are already out there in Japan and in Korea and our allies. And it would be a catastrophic result for the world that would make the Ukrainian conflict look like nothing.
Jim, could you just add to the mix as you see it in terms of, a professional intelligence officer's assessment of this comprehensive national power dynamic, the role that what I think of as China's chemical warfare in the form of fentanyl and its biological warfare in the form of COVID enter into the nature of the war that we actually are in with China at the moment.
It seems clear, Frank, that those two elements that you've just discussed, the opioids, invasion of America, and COVID, were all in some form or fashion obviously generated in China. There's still, I think, debate on some circles about whether or not the COVID was purposeful or not. What we know for sure, though, is once they knew about it, they didn't try to stop it. So they allowed that to come to America. They allowed those flights to come to America. Clearly, there's no question about fentanyl and opioids. That's a no-brainer. Or not no-brainer. It's unequivocal. They have been involved with that and pushing it. They want to pay back for the opium wars that Britain had against the PRC. We were not really that involved historically, but they are paying us. For them, it's payback, and what they believe is their loss of face and their century of humiliation. And we should be cognizant of their deep, deep animosity and hatred for America.
Thank you, Captain Fennell, as always. I do want to mention that in addition to his insights, I came across a very powerful piece that appeared in the Washington Times, I believe yesterday, by Miles Yu, who formerly was a senior counselor to then Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. He's now with the Hudson Institute. And it's a very important further input into the question of what's going on here between the Chinese and the Japanese. It's entitled "To Reframe Taiwan, Washington Should Heed Japan's Takaichi." And it essentially makes the case that what the Prime Minister of Japan has done in defending her nation's vital interests and making clear that was the topic of the response she gave to an opposition member in the Diet, that is the way we should be handling this too, not the kind of preoccupations with the matters of status and China's claims to Taiwan and so on, but rather what is in the vital interests of this country, as well as, of course, our Japanese allies and others, to say nothing of the Taiwanese. So I want to make sure that that is on your reading list as well for the holiday weekend, if possible. We're going to turn next to another of our most faithful contributors to these programs, another member of our Committee on the Present Danger, China, a man who, irrespective of the time of day, manages to pitch in, and we could not be more grateful to him for doing so. His name is Colonel Grant Newsom, United States Marine Corps retired. He, in addition to his service to our country in uniform, served as a Foreign Service officer in the embassy in Tokyo. He has been a businessman in East Asia for many years and has, as a result of all of this, a wealth of experience that has, among other things, informed his various essays and articles, but especially his best-selling book, When China Attacks, A Warning to America. We're delighted to have him with us. Let's go to Colonel Grant Newsom at this point.
Well, China crossed a line a long time ago when it came to actually being at war with the United States. If you ask the Chinese, they will tell you at least 30 years ago. Some would say 50 with the establishment of the Chinese Communist Party. But just take 30 for a rough estimate. Since that time, China has been building up a military which is intended for one purpose, and that's what the Chinese Communists told the PLA right after Tiananmen Square: be able to beat a military that has aircraft carriers. And that meant the United States. But it's more than just a military fight. And the Chinese have built up a military which, if they chose their spots and their timing, and it was a fight close to the Chinese mainland, they could probably defeat us, or at least give us a really bloody nose. If they fight off of San Diego or off of Cape Cod, we've got the advantage, of course. But this is a military that nobody is laughing about anymore. But it's not just the military, as I said, but rather China views warfare very differently than we do. The kinetic war, the shooting war, is just the last stage, if it's even necessary. And at a minimum, you've set up your enemy so that he's softened, he can't resist very well. And I'm talking about other forms of warfare. They can loosely be referred to as political warfare or unrestricted warfare. But the point is they're doing other things besides the so-called kinetic, the hard power that we always think of. And you go down the list here, and it's things like economic warfare. And how did the Chinese get the Americans to move so much of their manufacturing power over to China over the last 30 years? To the Chinese, that was a form of warfare against the United States. They got us to weaken our industrial base, to really gut most of middle-class America. So what were once thriving neighborhoods and societies in every American city, big and small, suddenly disappeared. And they look today like wastelands inhabited by zombies, rife with drug abuse, and set up for the fentanyl assault, which is chemical warfare that the Chinese have been waging on us for years. Fentanyl's been since about 2012-13, and since then they've killed about 750,000 Americans, and that's just the dead. And the wounded, the zombies, are about 10 times as many. So think of the effect that has had on America's society, on American families, on American economy. And what has been the punishment for that? Nothing. But the Chinese look at this very much as a form of warfare. And most of the people who have died are of military age. So it's the equivalent of taking about 3 or 4 divisions of Marines or Army off the battlefield every single year, and they've been doing it for well over a decade. And why has it been so successful? In the sense that nobody has fought back or bit back against the Chinese. Well, that's proxy warfare that the Chinese will tell you about. And that means you buy off, you get to start working for you, seeing things China's way in the elites, the influential groups of a target country. And that has worked in spades against the Americans. There's so much of Capitol Hill, Wall Street, the financial class, all of academia, and even a large part of the uniformed military leadership until fairly recently had been bought off one way or the other by the PRC to think that China was not a threat, and also in many cases, most cases, to see that China was actually important to their pocketbooks. So as a result of that, you find that fentanyl doesn't stop. Nobody does anything to the Chinese. All they do is talk about it. And think of how you cannot get TikTok to end. The Indians banned TikTok in about 72 hours and 30-some other Chinese apps. We still can't manage to do it. And that's, once again, successful proxy warfare, where TikTok has the best American lawyers and lobbyists working for it to make sure that the administration, or any administration, that wants to turn off this 24/7 sort of psychological warfare that the Chinese wage against us can't do it. So they've been very successful on a number of fronts, none of them having to do with actual military or kinetic hard power. And this is a war that has been ongoing, and you can see the effect it's had. We don't have the industrial base to fight a war against an enemy that doesn't wear loincloths and turbans. Against the Chinese, we're not even close to ready. The shipbuilding capacity, we know all about that. The Chinese outdo us about 200 times on the ability to build ships. They're putting into the water at least 5 warships for every one we do. Their Navy and Coast Guards are getting bigger. Ours are at best treading water. So this is all looks a lot like war, except in the sense that it's not shooting. So once again, going back to that fundamental concept of war, that the Americans tend to look at it like a 100-yard dash, where everybody comes up to the line, you shake loose, and you wait for the starter to shoot off the gun and go. And at that point, we think the war has started. But until that point, it's an American conceit that we can always talk anybody into being our friends, talk through any problems, settle our differences, and avoid conflict. That gets us into trouble. So we have refused to admit that we are at war. The Chinese, they would tell you, and all you have to do really is just listen to what the PRC says. Just read the press, the English language translations for a week, read Xi Jinping's document 9 that was given in about 2012 when he took power, just as the New York Times was saying that he was actually a secret reformer, and once he got his position set, then you would see China liberalize. Well, that didn't happen. And as a result, the Chinese have put us in a position where if we had to fight them, we would be in a lot of trouble. And as you'll note, they haven't fired a shot yet. So the Chinese sense of warfare is very different than ours, as I said. And they started the war at least 30 years ago. And they have made up a lot of ground, and in some areas they've overtaken us, and they put us in a position where we can't really respond very well, or as effectively as we could have. We've lost our edge. And that goes for our allies as well. So we're in a fix, and what do we do about it? The first thing you have to do is recognize that we are at war. And once you do that, you'll do well to follow Ronald Reagan's advice for dealing with the Soviets and bringing them down, is don't do anything that helps them. President Trump has, of course, been handed a hot potato by the people who mishandled this over the last 30, 40 years. And one doesn't envy him having to deal with it. So he's got a tough, very difficult card to play, or hand to play. But nonetheless, you'd better start now, or we're going to find ourselves, say, unable to take on the Chinese in a real war. And we'd better learn something about political warfare, these non-kinetic forms of warfare that I've just talked about. In the United States, we don't even do it. During the end of the Biden administration, the guy at the State Department who should have been responsible for such a thing was brought into Congress to testify, and he was asked, "What's your political warfare strategy?" His answer, "Couldn't you define political warfare for me?" If you ask the commander of U.S. Indo-PACOM about political warfare, he may not know what you're talking about, and if he did sort of figure it out, he'd say, well, that's somebody else's responsibility. So we'd better figure this out. And if we don't figure out political warfare of the sort that the Chinese are waging so successfully against us, we may find that if somehow magically we get our military edge back, that we still lose because we have had our position undercut so badly by successful Chinese political warfare. So it's it's not much good news today, but that is the big thing, is China sees war differently than us. And they started a long time ago, and we are in a lot of trouble. We can still get out of it, but my goodness, with baseball terms, it's the bottom of the seventh, and we're down by about 6. Okay, well, thanks very much for having me today. I appreciate it.
Colonel, thank you for this important contribution. We are, I think, going to be hearing more about the political warfare dimensions of all of this from some of our subsequent presenters, but thank you for setting the predicate for it. It's vital that we understand that is part of the unrestricted warfare playbook that is being wielded against us by the Chinese Communist Party. We're going to turn next to another great friend and valued contributor to much of what we do on these webinars and in raising the alarm more generally with the American people about the threat posed by the CCP. His name is Gordon Chang. He's an attorney by training, but he is one of the most prolific and, I think, impactful commentators and analysts of what the Chinese are up to and what it means for not just this country, but for the free world more generally. He is the author most recently of Plan Red, China's project to destroy America. He has also just penned an important piece in the Gatestone Institute, of which he is a senior distinguished fellow, that addresses this question of that he's going to be speaking to, which is the financial warfare piece. And I also want to commend to you another article that he wrote earlier in the week for Gatestone, in which he talked about the inadvisability of our removing the Typhoon missile system that had been deployed in Japan recently as part of exercises there on a Marine base, Colonel Newsom, and that was particularly inopportunely timed amidst this increasing and aggressive political warfare operation by the Chinese against Japan. We're going to hear from Gordon about the nature of the war and about what we best be doing about it. Let's go to his video, which he contributed again in the form of an interview with me on Securing America.
We Americans think of war as kinetic war, World War II, Korean War, etc. China has a project to destroy America, and we have to view it in terms of a struggle. Sometimes the war goes kinetic, but sometimes it isn't. But all the time, China is intending to take down our society. Now, to start with the basics, In May 2019, People's Daily, which is the most authoritative publication in China, carried a landmark editorial that declared a quote-unquote people's war on us. That's a term which it resonates in Communist Party thinking. It goes all the way back to the Maoist era. And if we needed a definition, PLA Daily, which is the main propaganda organ of the Chinese military, in March 2023 defined people's war as total war. Now, China, although it denies it, has a doctrine of unrestricted warfare. That's the title of that 1999 book from two Chinese Air Force colonels, which essentially argues that China can use any tactics, including terrorism, to take down the U.S. And to show you the nature of this struggle, in that book, they talk about bin Laden, who China at the time was actually supporting. They talk about bin Laden hitting the U.S. So that's 2 years before 9/11. So it gives you a dimension of all of this. Now, China knows that the United States is a far stronger society. And so what they've been trying to do is to weaken us. And they do it in a number of different ways. So you mentioned COVID-19. We know COVID-19 came from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. We don't know whether it was a manufactured biological weapon or whether it was just escaped pathogens. I think it was a biological weapon, but that's something, a question for virologists. And we know that it escaped into the Chinese population. And there are questions about that. But what's really important is not anything up to that point. It's what Xi Jinping did after that disease got into the Chinese population, because he then took two decisions. One of them is that he told the world it was not transmissible human to human when he knew it was highly contagious. He had to know it was highly contagious no later than the second week of December, but China did not admit human transmissibility until January 20 of 2020. And then he said it was only limited transmissibility. And then all the while, they were telling health officials around the world, including the United States on January 3, I think it was, that this was, don't worry about it. The other thing they did was, while they were locking down their own society, they were telling others to take arrivals from China without travel restrictions or quarantines. Lockdowns are controversial, but by locking down their own society, they were telling the world they thought this was an effective way to stop disease. You take these two things together, lying about contagiousness and the lockdowns, and it shows that the spread of this disease outside China's borders was deliberate. That means 7 million people outside of China who died from COVID. Those were murders. That includes 1.2 million Americans. We know about fentanyl. Last year, 48,000 Americans died from a drug which the Communist Party has been behind. They are fully behind the fentanyl scourge. We know that because fentanyl producers, some of them are state-owned, but even if they're not, China runs a total surveillance state, and they know what these fentanyl producers are doing. Chinese diplomats give cover to the gangs. Chinese central government provides subsidies for the production of fentanyl. Every container that leaves China is inspected by Chinese officials. China's TikTok promotes illicit drug use. The fentanyl gangs, they launder their proceeds through the Chinese state banking system. I could go on, but you can see that the fentanyl deaths are not overdoses, they're murders. We can go on a number of different things China's doing, but we can see that this is a long-term project to take down our country. And whether we think about war in kinetic terms or not, this is a struggle which is existential. The President of the United States has an obligation to talk to the American people about what Xi Jinping is doing, which is preparing all of Chinese society, not just the military, for war. We think we're a society at peace. We're not. And I think that this was a failure of our presidents going back to almost the turn of the century, not to talk to the American people about what China is doing. So although we're a far stronger society, as I mentioned, we could lose our country because we're not defending ourselves with the vigor and with the determination that is necessary. So there's a failure of the American society to understand the situation we are in, and that failure starts at the top. We don't understand the Chinese political system, and because of that, we are pouring money into the Chinese military, which is configuring itself to kill Americans. Just to give you an example, the Financial Times recently reported that there is a White House memo that talks about Alibaba, Chinese internet giant retailer, has been helping the Chinese military. And Alibaba and the Chinese embassy in the U.S. deny it, but we got to remember one thing, and that is China runs a unitary state. No entity in China may disobey an order of the Communist Party. So whether we're talking about a state-owned enterprise or a privately owned enterprise or a publicly listed enterprise, they all are required to help the Chinese military. And when you talk about Alibaba, there's also the issue of military-civil fusion, which is the doctrine that every entity and every person in China who has anything the military wants has to give it to the military. So really what we're talking about is a single state. And we don't view China that way. We think China is organized like we are, that you have a government and we've got private companies, and those private companies can defy the U.S. government. They don't have to follow what the U.S. government says. So for instance, Apple did that a few years ago in refusing to unlock its phones for it was either the Defense Department or one of the other national security agencies. That's perfectly permissible in our country. So we sort of assume that China's organized the same way. No, it's not. And because you have these big Chinese companies on our markets, they are taking cash from Americans. They're using it to develop their own businesses. And those businesses transfer important technology to the Chinese military. So, we have this distinction. We sometimes sanction Chinese military-linked companies. Well, every company in China, regardless of its business, is military-linked. And so, therefore, none of them should be on our exchanges. And also, Frank, Americans should not be permitted to invest in Chinese companies in China. And right now, there is a torrent of foreign cash going into China's equity markets. Now, yeah, the Chinese economy is stumbling, but the markets there are hot. And we are helping to fuel these Chinese military companies, which means all Chinese companies.
I wanted to ask you about a specific initiative that could be done basically right away without having to go through the, sausage making of legislation and getting the president's signature and so on. And that is ending a memorandum of understanding negotiated, as you know, with the help of then Vice President Joe Biden, who subsequently went on to become, I think, a Chinese asset, controlled asset, as Sam Faddis calls him, by allowing the Chinese Communist Party's companies, including ones that are tied to the PLA, as you say, preferential access to our capital markets, Gordon. They don't have to abide by our securities laws or regulations. Uniquely, not American companies can't do that, not European companies, nobody else, just those of our mortal enemy. What is wrong with that picture? And would you agree that Paul Atkins, the chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission, ought to rip this thing up right away, and within 30 days, that underpinning for this whole enterprise on Wall Street with China would come undone, I think.
Yeah. Whatever one thinks about Chinese companies on American exchanges, and there's all sorts of opinions about it, there is no justification for giving Chinese companies a free pass on U.S. securities laws. This is just, I don't understand the motivation for it. I don't understand why we permitted this. And yes, the SEC should rip up this memorandum immediately. And the Trump administration can do it without going through, as you say, the sausage making of American legislation, because the American markets are deep and they are the world's most attractive because the rules favor everybody. They make sure that these companies disclose. Well, we've given essentially the right to the Chinese not to disclose relevant information for investors. That corrodes the reputation of our markets. Why are we doing this? There is, as I said, no reason why. And I think the Trump administration needs to absolutely to revoke that memorandum, especially in light of that February America Investment First memorandum that the White House issued.
think the concluding thought there was that the president issued as a national security presidential memorandum on, as I recall, the 15th of February, 2025, maybe the 21st of February. A key project to have that become binding American policy and ideally enshrined in law. The article of which I spoke a moment ago that I wanted particularly to call to your attention is one that Gordon wrote entitled "Delist Alibaba and All Other China Companies." A small adjustment I would recommend is it ought to be the case that we end those registered to do business on Wall Street, not just those listed there. That's a much smaller number, but all of those, including A shares that are getting access to our capital markets without any disclosure to speak of. We're going to hear next from another very valued colleague who has a capacity always to help give us a broader perspective on the nature of this war. She happens to have been spending a prodigious amount of time raising awareness about what the Chinese are doing, going back to what we talked about a moment ago, in the way of political warfare and preparations for the kinetic kind in the Western and Central Pacific, among islands that have been fought and bled over by American Marines and others seeking to wrest them from the last totalitarian power that seized them and used them to threaten, among other things, us. And that would have been, of course, Imperial Japan. Her name is Cleo Pascal. She is a senior non-resident fellow for the Indo-Pacific at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and a veritable force of nature on all of these topics. And in particular, I think, is with the help of our friend Steve Bannon, popularized an understanding that some of those islands, notably the Marshall Islands, are part of America's western frontier and should be treated as such in the face of threats to them from communist China. Cleo, welcome back. It's great to have you. The floor is yours, ma'am.
Thank you very much. What a power-packed lineup. It's a lot to pull from. And one of the things that I'll be pulling from is what Gordon just talked about in terms of the attacks on the U.S. And what might be helpful is to understand exactly how big the U.S. is. And so if the genius that is Oleg could put up my map, it would probably be helpful for understanding the section. I want to talk about a part of the United States which is circled in red on the map here. That's the Commonwealth of Northern Mariana Islands, and it is, as Frank just described, a place where a lot of Americans died during World War II. Some of its islands, one is Saipan, another is Tinian. These were controlled by Japan from about 1914 until 1944, when the Americans came through. And after the war, they became a United Nations Trust territory, and then they voted to join the United States and became the newest part of the United States. It was a sort of a longer process, but they became part of the United States, and they share a maritime boundary with Japan, as you can see. So when we talk about Chinese activities in Japan or in Taiwan or in the Philippines, the U.S. is right there. It not only has Guam, which is right under the Commonwealth of Northern Mariana Islands, but it also has these islands these are American citizens on American soil. And I would argue that this location, the Northern Mariana Islands, is the most penetrated part of the United States by the Chinese Communist Party. And if you want to understand how they will operate in the rest of the United States, you can see it already at play here. And this would be a very good place to practice how to extricate the malicious Chinese activity from the U.S. system. Just to give you an idea, the Commonwealth of Northern Mariana Islands has a population of about 50,000 people. It is about an 8-hour flight west of Honolulu and about a 4-hour flight from Tokyo. That's how far out to the west the U.S. extends. And of those 50 or so thousand, it's very difficult to get an accurate census. The estimates from one former FBI agent there is that approximately 10,000 don't have legal papers to be living in the Commonwealth of Northern Mariana Islands. So that's got to be one of the highest percentages of any part of the U.S. Now, many of them are Filipinos, but a lot are Chinese. And the Chinese can still come in to the Commonwealth of Northern Mariana Islands without a visa. This is the only part of the U.S. where Chinese can just get on a plane in China and get off a plane without a visa in the United States. Now, they're not supposed to leave the Commonwealth of Northern Mariana Islands, but in many cases, or at least by the hundreds and likely more, they're illegally taking boats the 60 miles or so to Guam, where they've been found wandering around military bases. Additionally, there was a casino, a Chinese-owned and run casino in Saipan that was processing billions of dollars, billions with a B, per month through its system from the Chinese economic system into the U.S. financial system. And the former director of the CIA, James Woolsey, was on the board, and Louis Freeh, former director of the FBI, was one of the advisors. Additionally, you can see how that Chinese money has bought it influence, including in Congress. We have the representative from the Commonwealth of Northern Mariana Islands in Congress, and they're part of the U.S. They do have a representative of Congress. She consistently pushes for maintaining this visa-free access for Chinese. She's also pushing for a lifting of the cap on direct flights from mainland China into Guam and the Marianas, Northern Marianas. And the current Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Department of Interior, and this area does fall under Interior, is a man called Angel Demapan. He's a political appointee, but he seems to have been one that fell through the vetting cracks, because when he ran for office in the Marianas, he was an elected member of their legislature there. The FEC found that he illegally took money from Chinese companies, including that Chinese casino that I mentioned. And he subsequently wrote legislation that facilitated the operations of that Chinese casino. So what starts in Saipan doesn't stay in Saipan. It comes in through the financial system, through the political system, both elected and appointed. And it is a unmonitored border entry point for the U.S. And it has immediate security implications, obviously. And the question is, what direction is it going to go in? Because there was a very honest governor of the Commonwealth of Northern Mariana Islands who repeatedly asked the federal government to send in the FBI, send in Treasury, anybody to help him clean up his system. I've never heard of a U.S. government official saying, my books are open, come in and take a look at anything you want. But Governor Palacios of the Marianas did that. And then he died suddenly in July of this year. And part of the issue around his death is the situation with medical care. Now, he needed to be medevaced to Guam for treatment, and there was a delay in that happening. But it gives an indication of how poorly prepared CNMI and Guam are in case of any sort of attack. We're talking about an attack. If there's an attack on Taiwan, then of course, we talk about Japan getting hit or Philippines getting hit. Well, what about those Americans that are on American soil just across the way, which are living in places that are where real problems for the Chinese can be caused? And we already saw the Volt Typhoon cyber infiltration into the Guam system. We've seen these Chinese wandering around the bases. We know that disabling Guam has to be very high on Chinese destabilization lists, if not elimination lists. And their healthcare system can't even handle the current state of civilian healthcare, let alone what the veterans, and there are many U.S. veterans living in those locations, require for proper care. In many cases, they have to fly to Hawaii for proper care. So this is a very, very serious problem on U.S. soil, on this front line. Again, I would argue that the Commonwealth of Northern Mariana Islands is the most penetrated part of the U.S. It's getting very little oversight. So what needs to be done? First of all, full-bore anti-corruption investigations into what's going on in the Commonwealth of Northern Mariana Islands. But at the same time, you need to block the Chinese, what the Filipinos call ICAD, illegal, coercive, aggressive, and deceptive activity. So you need to block it while at the same time building up other opportunities, economic opportunities for the local Americans who are there, and resilience. And so that could mean, for example, looking at setting up training centers to help people enter the merchant marines, shipbuilding, building innovation hubs in Guam. If God forbid fighting does start, you're going to have a very hard time resupplying Guam with ammunition or health supplies, things like that. Others on this call are much better equipped to know the details than I am, but I know that right now there ain't much. So you better be able to produce it there rather than think you can fly 8 hours across the center of the Pacific from Hawaii, because there are problems all across the center of the Pacific as well, which we don't have time to get into this time, but we've talked about before in places like the Marshall Islands, the Federated States of Micronesia, and Palau. So more good news for you from yet another contributor to the call, but it doesn't take much to give the honest people of the Marianas hope that the rest of America does care about them and wants them to be able to live free of the sort of cognitive warfare that we're seeing. And I would just as a last point, to give you an idea of how advanced this is, there is a very active movement in Guam now to look at free association. Now, what the term free association would imply is that first Guam leaves the United States, becomes independent, and then freely associates with the U.S. So there are, in terms of the political warfare, cognitive warfare stuff, the anti-U.S. activity, military activity specifically in the Marianas and in Guam is being actively discussed, including through think tanks with concerning funding streams, and in the context of having them leave the U.S. completely, which would, of course, leave them open to even more Chinese predation. And that's it. Over to you. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Cleo. And there is some good news there, and I think it's something we're going to be building on in our final presentation, which is that we can successfully wage political warfare and use other techniques of our own unrestricted warfare capabilities if we simply recognize the danger we're facing and have the will to respond appropriately. I'm very pleased to welcome back once again for the purposes of both sort of closing us out as well as advancing that proposition. Dr. John Lenchowski, PhD, a man who played a pivotal role the last time a totalitarian communist nation sought to take this country out, namely during the Cold War. He served on Ronald Reagan's National Security Council staff as the senior director for Europe and Soviet affairs. He also served for time in the State Department. He has been, since leaving government, the incredibly impactful founder, initially president, now chancellor of the Institute for World Politics, one of the finest educational institutions in America, and one that is imbuing future generations of American government officials and leaders with an understanding of statecraft and what it takes to protect this country using what he calls full spectrum diplomacy and other techniques. We couldn't be more pleased to have him with us on very short notice, and as always, to benefit from his counsel about not just the nature of the problem, the fact that it is war yet, and even more importantly, to share with us his insights into what we need to do to wage it capably and decisively. Dr. Linchowski, welcome back. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Frank. It's great to be with you and with so many of your distinguished guests. I would just like to begin by saying that there is a temptation amongst American political leaders to try to create an atmosphere of peace, even with our adversaries. And it's a temptation that can, where our successive presidents believe that it's possible to have some kind of a relaxation of tensions with these adversaries. But there's a fundamental principle of diplomacy, and that is that you cannot have a relaxation of tensions unless you have a relaxation of concerns. And there are so many concerns about communist China, the tyrannical, totalitarian nature of its system, its human rights violations, its crimes against its own people, its aggression against its neighbors, its political and economic and narcotics warfare against us. Those are all concerns, and they cannot be swept under the rug. And so therefore, we need to, the most important thing that has to be done here is that the American people, and particularly our elites, many of whom have been co-opted in the political warfare that Grant and that Gordon has described, that they be brought to a fundamental realization about what is going on here. And this means that the President of the United States has to tell the truth. This is what Ronald Reagan did. And of course, nobody wanted him to tell the truth in the interests of détente with the Soviet Union during the 1970s. We had a bipartisan consensus thinking that we could sweep concerns about Soviet behavior, both at home and abroad, under the rug and have nice agreements and champagne treaty signing ceremonies with them and so on. And I think there's a abiding temptation in our own in current days dealing with China to sweep it all under the rug, telling that the number one strategic objective of the Soviet Union during those years, particularly in Reagan's first term, was to get him to shut up, to stop telling the truth about the military buildup, about all the other things they were doing. Because he knows that the Kremlin knew that by telling the truth, the president would be building a pro-defense consensus in this country. We need to restore some semblance of reciprocity in our relations with China. If we let them continue their aggression, whether it's gray zone aggression against the Philippines, Taiwan, Japan, and so on, or their subversion and espionage and narcotics warfare, and of course, not only in bringing agrochemicals, agrotoxins to the University of Michigan, setting up a biological warfare lab in the Central Valley of California, and so on. If we let them do all of this stuff with no response, we will continue to send signals of weakness to Beijing, which will then, as we at IWP call it, it will be provocative weakness. And they will be tempted to take increasingly aggressive action against Taiwan, the Philippines, Japan, and us, and the credibility of our deterrent forces, whether they are kinetic forces or non-kinetic forces, the moral force, the political force that our country represents. will all be weakened. So we need to shed illusions about, we need to shed a number of illusions about the alleged permanence of the Chinese Communist regime. The engagers all in this country, the panda huggers, all believe that China, the communist regime, is an immutable force on the global strategic landscape. This is not true. This is what the détentistes thought about the Kremlin during during the Cold War. It's not true with China. The Chinese communist regime will collapse. One day it will. God knows when it will be. We could help bring about that collapse the way we helped put straws on the Soviet camel's back. We need to shed illusions about how that regime has allegedly changed and ceased to be communist. That means you need to be educated. We need to be educated about communism. And nobody practically is being. Maybe if you come to IWP, you'll learn something about it. But elsewhere, it's incredible how ignorant people are about it. We have to shed illusions that the atmospherics of peace constitute genuine peace. And all the political advisors of presidents, both parties, they want to have the atmospherics of peace, the Champagne Treaty signing ceremonies and all of that. We have to stop being solely on the defensive, and we have to go on a non-kinetic offensive. And the beginning of that kind of a strategy involves targeting and undermining in war, in the political war in which we are, the unrestricted war in which we are, the adversary's center of gravity, the enemy's center of gravity. I identify that center of gravity as the internal security system of the communist regime. The center of gravity is that without which the adversary cannot make war or cannot even survive as a regime. And in China, that internal security system, the nucleus of that system, of course, the internal security system has its millions of informants, its millions of internet police, its slave labor system called the Laogai, which nobody knows about because our co-opted media won't report what the Laogai is, and nobody knows the word. But the nucleus of that internal security system is the regime's monopoly of communications and information, alongside the Marxist-Leninist ideology with Chinese characteristics, which enforces thought control, semantic control, speech control, and ultimately behavior control. Then we need to seek the sympathy of and alliance with the Chinese people to assist them in their efforts not only to hear the truth, because when you live in a cage dominated by communist Chinese propaganda, you don't always know what life is like fully in the world. Even if you come as a student to the United States, as the Chinese communist princelings do, they are subjected to their minders. They have to watch out that they won't be put under arrest in one of the Chinese police stations in one of our major cities. They have to be very careful about how they behave, and they don't really experience full freedom. We need the Chinese people to be able to tell the truth themselves in the face of the pressure to repeat the official lies of the regime. We need to help them communicate with one another so that they can demand and realize political change. We have to distinguish, in other words, between the regime and the people. The CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, does not represent the nations, the Chinese nation, nor any of the captive nations within the Chinese Communist Empire. And that means we need to question, first of all, the legitimacy of the regime, because it is an illegitimate regime. It rules without the consent of the governed, and yet it pretends as if it it really represents the Chinese nation when in fact it does not. What is its legitimizing vehicle? The Marxist-Leninist ideology with Chinese characteristics, which is otherwise known as Xi Jinping thought. And it is easy to refute Marxism-Leninism if you know something about it. And we also need to make clear that the Marxist-Leninist ideology is a Western import, a toxic Western import that is totally alien to traditional Chinese culture. The impact it has had on China means that far from liberating China from a century of humiliation, it continues that humiliation and it will continue until the CCP collapses. We need to expose how the regime maintains enforced conformity, not only amongst the people, but amongst party members and members of the Chinese armed forces. You know, what is so remarkable is that we've seen all these purges of both party officials and the military. And what that indicates to me is that party members, you know, it's a breakdown of party discipline. And Xi Jinping and his confederates are trying to bring about ideological purity and conformity within the party when ordinary party members, including very senior ones, feel like being human beings. And being a human being means thinking a little bit independently of the lies of the Communist Party line. And the same with the military officers. Insofar as they are corrupt, it is a sign of their humanity, and they're not ideological robots. And so the continued imposition of the Marxist-Leninist ideology as an element of party discipline and internal security ends up depriving everybody, even party members and military officers, of their human dignity. And this is a form of governance that needs to be exposed to the entire world so that the CCP's vision of a new world order doesn't come to pass. Now, to split the yes,
John,
Frank.
Could I ask you to wrap up? We're pressing up against the end of our time together.
Yes, yeah.
Thank you.
I would just want to say, to split the CCP from the people, we need to anathematize the party. We need to expose the human rights violations and the crimes which the Chinese people don't want to be associated with. We need to resist features of the Chinese regime that are contrary to Chinese popular culture, like religion. We need to support all the different religious groups. The regime is scared to death of religion in China. We need to have outreach to the Chinese diaspora. We need to show that the PLA, the so-called People's Liberation Army, the very repetition of that term is a lie. It's not people's, it's not a national army, it's not liberation, it's slavery. We shouldn't even use the expression PLA in our own language because we're repeating a lie. But we have to show that it's not a national army. And we need to have a two-track foreign policy, one that deals with the regime and another that deals with the people. And the best way of dealing with the people is to broadcast to them, is to communicate with them through our radio, television, internet, every form, multimedia broadcasts. And that will help them, we will give them the truth. We'll give them alternative ideas, we'll give them their honest history, and we will help with their internal communications. And that is the beginning of bringing down the CCP regime.
John Guando, this is such a comprehensive treatment, and it's such an important part of this overall conversation about the war that's been waged against us so successfully for so long, and the fact that we do have options, that we can take action on our part to stave off what might otherwise be headed our way. We have time for just a very quick round of questions, and I so appreciate those of you who stayed with us for the purpose. Karen Sigmund, just quickly, you have, I think, as a result of the work that you're about, the programs that you run, the roadshows and so on, a feeling for the importance of engaging the American people in all of this. As I said earlier, I think they have a need to know. Could you talk a little bit about how best to do that? You're an educator by training as well as a scientist. Just some quick thoughts on building on what we've just heard.
Well, thank you. Yes, so much of this, as we've all noted, is because of tremendous ignorance that the war is in fact being waged against us. And I think to Dr. Lanchowski's point, the trappings of peace, the atmospherics of peace, we like the idea of embracing them, but the reality is we really ought not. And I think part of this also is the reason we're so vulnerable and have been is the left, communism generally speaking, has done a very thorough, effective, long march through the institutions, making us very vulnerable. That's through education, through all these vehicles, political warfare, and so on. How do we combat this? We here need to do everything possible to get truth back in the universities, in the media, in fiction, in nonfiction. People have to be made aware, one way or another, through our politicians, that we have been losing a war waged against us by people desperate to conquer us. We need to talk to the young people. It's not just China. Generally speaking, throughout the US, people's ignorance of communism is profound. Yes, against the Chinese Communist Party, not the people, as was noted, but in our conversation, we need to be very clear. War has been being waged against us. We need to speak out about China, about communism. And I think one of the main points that I've been trying to make in everything that I do with AFA is a commensurate speaking out in praise, in gratitude, in recognition of all that is marvelous about this country. The counterpoint between us and everything to do with the Chinese Communist Party and communism generally, I think just being praiseful and grateful of all the opportunities, the bounty, the freedom that we have here can go a long way towards setting up a bulwark against those seeking to take us down. It's always been an inoculant. Our founders always knew that teaching, and we've always known until recent decades, teaching the virtues and of our foundation are a crucial bulwark against incursions such as the Chinese Communist Party, the Soviet Union, various other totalitarian attempts at conquest. So that's two parts I think we need to do: speak the truth about communism and speak the truth about what we have here, and be proud of what we are, what we have, be grateful of it, and set it constantly as a counterpoint to their system, their beliefs, their ideologies.
Brilliant. Thank you, Karen. Especially, to be giving thanks at this time of year is an absolutely appropriate message for all of us, as well as how best to do it. Grant Newsom, you've, as I mentioned, not only served in the military arms, but also in the diplomatic corps. John Gwendol has given us some great suggestions here. I just wonder if you've got some thoughts based on both what he said about broadcasting, but more generally, how we organize for political warfare and how we do it right quick, ideally.
Well, first, we're going to have to take somebody, Marco Rubio's level probably, to say, look, we need to learn political warfare. We used to do it in the Cold War. We did it well. Now we don't even teach it at Foreign Service Institute. So it's going to take some top-down pressure to get it done. And then you bring in a few of the right people, give them a credit card, but just give them some freedom to move. And you could run wild against the Chinese. We're not even in the fight now. So you've got to relearn this subject. It's like one of the lost arts. We decided we didn't want to do it or need to do it anymore. There are people who understand it. Professor Kerry Gershanik comes immediately to mind. You could send him over to Foreign Service Institute and you'd have something good happen there. But State Department has to take some responsibility for it. If they won't, then US Indo-PACOM or somewhere in the Pentagon could do it. But Indo-PACOM would be a good place to do it. But it requires people who know what they're doing, know the subject, and turn them loose. But as it is, we're in pretty bad shape now. But it's not hard to do. I'd say within a matter of months, you could have something pretty effective going and jamming a lot of what the Chinese are doing down their throats.
Yeah, terrific and very heartening. And especially if the military could be persuaded that this is, in fact, part of their portfolio. We could bring a lot of very capable people to bear. And I strongly second your suggestion about Kerry Gershanik, a member of our Committee on the Present Danger China, political warfare expert par excellence, rather. Let me turn, Cleo, to you. You have given us some examples, some very specific examples of the phenomenon the Chinese call elite capture, which, as we've documented in many of these programs, is such an incredibly important component of their unrestricted warfare strategy. Do you have some other thoughts as to how that can best be countered and exposed? I know we've talked on this program with you and others frequently, including especially with Trevor Loudon, about using sort of counter mafia techniques to both expose and fracture the captured elites and the kind of monolithic presence they have, it seems, at the moment in stopping us from responding appropriately to the war that's being waged against us. Your thoughts, ma'am?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, as Dr. Lanchowski said, I mean, a lot of it comes, you can start off by describing the actual damage that these people are causing, which could help create an environment in which prosecution, or at least moving them out of the positions that they're in, would be easier. I mean, it is completely incomprehensible to me that the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Insular Affairs at the Department of Interior is somebody who the FEC found took money from Chinese corporations, and who has a track record of working with one of the most investigated for corruption governors in CNMI, and who has worked in the congressional office that lobbied for increased access to the U.S. by Chinese bad actors. I mean, something has gone very wrong in the vetting process. So not only, I think, do you need to make sure that people like that don't retain their position, because that I'm going to focus on this very specific position, the one held by Angel Demipan, because I don't think that Americans know that this position, it doesn't sound important, but the whole center of the Pacific is overseen by the Department of Interior, not Department of State, Department of Interior. So Interior covers an area the size of the continental United States in the middle of the Pacific, where the fiercest fighting of World War II happened. These are the battles of Peleliu. This is where Ulithi is. This is where Truk Lagoon, Kwajalein, Saipan. And after World War II, it was decided that if this area was controlled by hostile foreign powers, mainland U.S. would not be safe, and Guam wasn't enough. And that was why they were all offered, the whole region was offered to become part of the United States. Palau, Marshall Islands, Federal States of Micronesia were offered to join the United States. They opted, because they had been colonized for many centuries, to go independent, but to sign these compacts of free association with the U.S., which makes them a place where the U.S. has strategic denial and can deploy. So this whole area is under Interior, and this man, who everybody in the region knows took Chinese money, is the face of the U.S. administration. He sits on he chairs the commissions that oversee the distribution of the U.S. government money to Federated States of Micronesia and Marshall Islands. He represents the U.S. In important ceremonies. When Governor Palacios was laid to rest, he was the one who officiated at the consecration of the cemetery where he was laid to rest. So you are signaling that the U.S., the entire region, and by the way, it also oversees American Samoa, knows that the U.S. government either doesn't know or doesn't care that China has infiltrated Washington to such a degree that somebody who has such deep ties to Chinese money, very dodgy money, is the one that is representing the U.S. administration in the most strategically important area of the U.S. He sits in, he is privy to discussions about how Guam is going to defend itself. So this is just one example, but it is definitely an egregious example. And as long as this stands, it's very difficult to see how you can do anything else. He will, if there is a Treasury or an FBI investigation into the Marianas or into what's going on in Guam, he would know about it. And he would, in fact, probably be a target of the investigation, at least in CNMI. And he would be in a position to potentially slow it down or derail it. So, it's not just him, it's how did he get selected? How did he get appointed? Who are the people involved in putting him in place? These are the sort of things that if the U.S. is serious about defending the Pacific and the American citizens who live there, who are on American soil, a 4-hour flight away from Tokyo, about 5 hours from Taiwan, then this needs to be resolved quickly. Shouldn't have happened in the first place, and it needs to be found out why it happened.
Thank you for so tenaciously calling attention to this, and we are anxious at the Committee on the Present Danger China to make corrective action here a priority, and hopefully set the predicate for sort of a broader approach towards captured elites. And in fact, to that end, if I can shamelessly flog it, coming out of the first 70 or so of these webinars, Didi Laugesen and I produced a book called The Indictment, prosecuting the Chinese Communist Party and friends for crimes against America, China, and the world. And I think very much is aligned with what you just said, Cleo, and we very much hope that at the very minimum in the court of public opinion, these people can be exposed and prosecuted, held accountable, and removed from positions in which they are doing such harm. John Lanchowski, finally to you, and very briefly, if you would, please. I'm so appreciative of the point that you made, especially drawing upon your experience, and I had a bit of a share of it myself, of going up against what we were told by the likes of Henry Kissinger and successive presidents and intelligence agency leaders and so on, was the immutable fact of life of the Soviet Union, that it was going to outlast us, it was going to bury us even. When you make the case, John, and you did it very powerfully today, as you have in the past, that it ain't necessarily so, not certainly with respect to the Soviet Union, as you proved that with President Reagan, but not with respect to the Chinese Communist Party either. And I think what I would just ask you to sort of summarize quickly with us is, in making that case to President Trump, who evidently is not only, as we know, transactional, and as I've suggested in an article in Gateway Pundit this week, post-ideological, but seemingly disposed not to really rock the boat with the CCP, perhaps over rare earth minerals or something else, pharmaceuticals. But if you had just his ear for a minute, what would you say about the need to make clear that we do not intend to abide, let alone perpetuate, the Chinese communist tyranny and the threat that it poses to us, sir?
Well, Frank, it's a great question. I believe that President Trump should understand that foreign relations consists of two halves. One is relations with governments, and the other is relations with people. And the latter is called public diplomacy, which means relations with and influence over people. And we should have a capacity to conduct both at the same time. And if all the president wants to do is make a nice transactional deal with the Chinese regime, he's not making a deal with the Chinese people. I think he needs to make a deal with the Chinese people, and that has to be on his radar screen. And that ultimately the Chinese communist regime has so many internal contradictions. It is so contrary to human nature. Yes, there are people who are in a burgeoning middle class, which is not going to grow much more because of the growing weaknesses of the Chinese economy. But there are 1 billion people in China that are not enjoying the fruits of that. And the people who are enjoying the fruits are cozy with the Communist Party and its ability to control capital. And so, this is a system whose internal contradictions will cause it at some point to fail. And the question is, where are we going to be in our relations with the Chinese nation and the other nations within the extended Chinese empire, the Uyghurs, the Tibetans, the Mongols, the Hui, and so on. And I think that he needs to make a deal with the Chinese people, and that needs to be part of his diplomacy.
Thank you, John Lachowski. Thank you to each and every one of you for exceptionally powerful presentations. It is impossible, in my humble opinion, to come away from this conversation still deluded into thinking that there is no problem with the Chinese Communist Party. It is, in fact, at war with us. It is increasingly aggressively pursuing that war. It appears that it is prepared sufficiently to do the one thing that has not yet been done in the People's War or the unrestricted warfare before it, and that is full-on kinetic operations, if the Chinese Communist Party chooses to engage in them. They may yet hope to win without fighting by the cumulative effect of all the things that we've discussed here today. And if they are to succeed, it will be because we fail to heed the warnings that we've offered, the evidence that is now beyond ignoring, the implications for everyone we love, everything we hold dear, for the very country that makes it all possible, that we persist in ignoring it at, as I say, the peril of all of that. We hope that this particular program, and indeed the body of work of which it is a part, the Committee on the Present Danger China, all of which is available for free at presentdangerchina.org, will resonate with you and prompt you to do as we've just been encouraged to do, and that is to take the fight, at least in the political warfare sense, to the heart of the problem, the Chinese Communist Party, and work with the people of China to the end of bringing about their liberation and the end of the threat that the CCP represents to us and freedom-loving and freedom-aspiring people worldwide. I want to wish you all a very blessed as well as happy Thanksgiving, and that this will be the occasion upon which we reflect on the incredible things that we have to be thankful for in being in this country, as Karen Sigeman said so well, both understanding the alternative that we're confronting from China. And one might add, by the way, another of our projects, the Victory Coalition, just did a marvelous presentation yesterday, as it happens, on the threat from Sharia supremacists, another very dangerous vector headed our way, especially to the extent that they collaborate against us along with globalists. These are the sorts of things we have to be cognizant of and to be thankful we may yet have a chance to spare our country what they have in mind for us. And if we do, it will be with your help. Please share this video and join me in thanking Oleg Atbashian, who does so much day after day to make these programs possible and as accessible and as impactful as they can possibly be. We're grateful to him, thankful for him, as well as all of our presenters today. God bless you, and the best for the Thanksgiving holiday. Over and out.